Dr. Scott Kaufman is here. He's the history chair, Francis Marion University, and a worthy foe. I guess that's the ultimate compliment that Jefferson gave Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Thomas Jefferson called Alexander Hamilton a worthy foe. And if you want to be complimented by Jefferson, that's probably as high a compliment as could be paid from one of our great founders. You see the world like I do. One of our lesser great founders, but still great nonetheless. He who was very much supportive of a big central government. Speaking of big central governments, I want to kind of start on something, and then we'll end up with Kavanaugh and your opinion there. I've talked fairly extensively in the last couple of days, today in particular, about what happened in 07 and 08. You know, the fact that the world blew up. I mean, I know that's not the official way to describe it, but the housing market affects so many factors and sectors of our economy. I was in the truck body business, and rest assured, when people were building homes and clearing lots, my life was a lot better than when they weren't. So if you say, well, I'm not in the housing market, that doesn't really affect me. Yes, it does. I mean, we're all in some way, shape, or form affected. By most accounts, our largest investment or purchase that we'll ever make. I'm not asking you what have we learned as a result of that. I've got kind of an opinion, and I think my opinion is human nature is what human nature is. I think we have addressed a lot of the ills of the housing market, but I think psychologically, Dr. Kaufman, we still are who we've always been, and that is a nation of people who want everything, who want it now, who, if they can't afford it with their income, want to borrow money to do whatever necessary to get that next rung on the ladder. You know what I mean? That other 100 square feet in their home, that nicer car. It's who we've become. And I'm not saying it's good or bad. I mean, we're the most consumptive country in the world. We're the most productive country by and large in the world. But from your perspective, do you think I'm off base when I say that a lot of what happened in 07 and 08 will happen again? Because philosophically, we're still who we were then.
I mean, let's go back to Alexander Hamilton. I mean, Alexander Hamilton said that people naturally don't worry about their own interests. That's one of the reasons he wanted a strong central government, was to create a sense of community where nation actually has a sense of importance and people work together for the common good as opposed to worrying about their own interests.
No question about it.
And that's going to be part of human nature, worrying about your own interests, what will be best for you. And I think we're going to see this happen again. I honestly believe that it will happen. I mean, one of the reasons why we had what happened was because of deregulation. Deregulation of the banks. We're now seeing a movement toward that again. I am very concerned that the idea of the banks regulating themselves, well, that didn't work very well with the S&L crisis in the late 1980s. It didn't work very well with the banking crisis and the housing crisis we had in the last decade, and it could happen again. And it's one of the reasons why I'm an historian, and I believe history is so important.
But
we have to learn from our past.
Do you believe that what happened was a failure of capitalism?
There are those who will argue that. I would not argue that personally.
Was it a failure of, I'm going to use another word, was it a failure of corporatism? In other words, people that have lobbied the federal government, do you believe it was a failure of a group of people? Well, I'll leave unnamed. You know who they are. It's the Goldman Sachs of the world. Right. It's the Citibanks, the Bank of America. It's the huge financial conglomerates who dictate so much of what happens in the world of finance in America. Do you believe, because I don't believe it's a failure of capitalism, and I'll disagree with you on regulation and deregulation, but I mean, that's kind of our fundamental disagreement of government. But do you believe it was a failure of a group of people who have so lobbied this big, powerful government to get their way, consequences be damned?
I think there is some truth to that. And we've talked about this on the radio before, that the concern is, and this is one of the reasons why many Americans turn against the quote-unquote establishment, the idea that those in Congress who are themselves oftentimes moneyed are going to be tied to the interest that will give them the support, the moneyed support that they need. And so there's this sense of, who are the members of Congress going to listen to? Are they going to listen to the average voter who might give them, I don't know, $100 toward their next reelection campaign, or to the Goldman Sachses of the world who give them thousands upon thousands of dollars? And the response from many Americans will be, well, members of Congress won't bite the hand that feeds them. I would hope that we would learn our lessons from this, but unfortunately, I think that one of the things about Americans, and maybe some of your listeners disagree with me, but I think one of the problems with Americans is we can be very short-minded, so have short memories.
Would you agree with this statement? I'd love to hear your take on this. I mean, I'm saying something that I agree with. I want to get your opinion on this. In the truest sense of capitalism, we would have fixed it quicker, because you would have had moral hazard. You would have had bank failures. You would have had people who made irresponsible decisions, suffer the consequences of those irresponsible decisions. A lot of people will argue that, I'm not saying Wall Street caused all the problem. I'm certainly not insinuating that, because at the end of the day, you as an individual consumer borrow money that you know in your heart you'll never be able to pay back. I get the human nature, like Red said. I mean, we do it with good intent, but we know that there's no way we'll ever make this work. But government intervention and Goldman Sachs and a lot of these other huge financial empires were very much on board with what government perceived to be the American dream, and that was home ownership. So do you believe that capitalism, if left unchecked, if unfettered capitalism, in other words, if the moral hazard of capitalism, if the motivations, both winning and losing of capitalism, were allowed to be the dominant force in what happened and how we dealt with what happened, that we'd be in a better place today? Or do you believe Bernanke, with his involvement and I guess the intrusion of our federal government, quantitative easing and bond buybacks and all these other sorts of things, do you believe there's a fair debate to be had as it relates to what government should or should not have done? And do you believe that we would have fared better if we would have let pure capitalism come into play and failures take place and moral hazard be a primary force in that equation?
Well, when you say pure capitalism, I assume you mean laissez-faire capitalism.
Yeah, correct.
Okay. That certainly would be the point of view of the Rush Limbaughs of the world, who would have said, yeah, let these banks fail, let these industries fail.
Because that's capitalism.
And we'll learn from our mistakes, and it won't happen again. Two problems I have with that. Number one is that we would have had a depression unlike anything we've ever seen in this country. We could still possibly feel the impacts of that to this day, given how deep it would have been. And second of all, it comes back to a point I just made a minute ago. Let's assume for a minute that we had these failures and we're just now getting out of it. Or maybe we got out of it 3 years ago, like we are currently. We're getting out of it. How long will Americans' memories be? It seems to me that we seem to forget these things. We just celebrated 9/11. How many Americans remember 9/11 and think about what it meant for this country and the impact it had? And how many Americans simply go, well, what am I going to have for breakfast today? Or what am I going to be doing tomorrow? And I'm not by any means suggesting that Americans don't care about what happened on 9/11. What I'm getting at is that I think for us, and this is something that Alexander Hamilton talked about, what is in my best interest? And so we forget about some of these other things that have these massive ramifications and go on to something else. And the risk is that even if we don't have a reoccurrence of what happened in 2007, 2008, if it doesn't happen in 2018, maybe it'll happen in 2028, 2038, because we forget the lessons we would have learned.
And I'll agree with that. The only exception I'll take is, and I don't disagree that there potentially could have been a depression. I think it would have been a short-lived depression. I think the fundamentals would have been incredibly different today. The one thing I will say, to disagree with you a little bit, is the one difference would have been, instead of there being $650 billion on the Fed balance sheet, there would be $4.1 trillion. I mean, that's kind of where we are. We're beginning to unwind about $4 trillion of financial aid that was given to the private sector as a result of Fed intervention. And you can say it would have been real rough and tumbly for a while, and it would have been. And the unexpected probably scare the daylights out of most smart people. But I still go back to the quantitative easing and the Fed involvement. On their balance sheet now rest about $4 trillion, when traditionally there's about 650 to 700 billion on that balance sheet.
Let me throw another thought in here, just an historical analogy. One of the reasons why Franklin Roosevelt instituted the New Deal during the Depression was his fear that if he didn't impose some kind of regulations on capitalism, that Americans would turn toward communism. And indeed, there had been a growth of support in this country for socialism and communism at that time. So he saw it as a way to protect capitalism as opposed to destroying it. What would have happened if we had done what Rush Limbaugh said and just let these companies collapse, these banks collapse?
We'll never know.
Yeah, right. But would Americans have become so disenchanted with capitalism they would have said, you know what, maybe socialism is the way to go? Would we see an increase in the number of people who were supporting socialism? I know we're seeing it right now, particularly among younger folk. Would we have seen that on a much broader basis at this time?
Let's shift gears and go to the Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh. It appeared to me that he was on autopilot. It appeared to me that all the Republicans and maybe 2 or 3, even as many as 4 Democrats were going to vote. And they were going to vote, to your point, self-preservationists. They were going to vote because they were in states that Trump won, and it was in their political best interest to support Brett Kavanaugh. Now we have a late-breaking story. Dianne Feinstein has had some information, from what I understand, since June or July. She has sat on the information. She chose to reveal the information, and now there's an accusation that Brett Kavanaugh, at the age of 17, forced himself upon a 15-year-old female who is a professor at Stanford. It'll basically boil down, you may disagree, it'll basically boil down, who do you believe? He's just denied it to the nth degree. She has stood by her story. They have both been invited to Capitol Hill on Monday. Both have agreed to testify. What do you make of of this story? And does it, I mean, obviously it'll slow down the vote because there was to be a vote on Thursday in the committee, and it would have been along party lines, 11-10 coming out of committee and approval. What do you think happens to the process and potential nomination of Brett Kavanaugh with this last and latest revelation?
Well, it's certainly going to delay the vote, obviously. We'll have to hear what both individuals have to say. I wish that the questioning would not be done by members of the Senate. I wish it would have been done by legal counsels instead. But you've got some individuals in the Senate who have presidential ambitions. All of them have...
In both parties?
In both parties. They have political interests of their own, and so they are not going to step aside. So what kind of questions will be asked is something else, of course, that has to be considered here. And it's going to come down, I think, to a case of he said versus she said, not unlike what we saw what happened with Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. Of course, there are some differences between the two cases, such as the age difference. Clarence Thomas never forced himself physically on Anita Hill, as opposed to this allegation we have in this case. I really don't know what's going to come of it. I think we'll have to I think it's going to come down to public opinion more than anything else.
From your perspective, as someone who's not crazy about the current president, what is a disqualifier? If there's a revelation found in this 1 or 2 day ordeal, from your perspective, what is a disqualifier? What disqualifies Brett Kavanaugh from being fit to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court?
If he perjures himself. I mean, we could talk about the issue of morality here.
So if he's denying, unequivocally denying, and he's not being honest, you think that's a disqualifier?
If he perjures himself, absolutely it's a disqualifier. And even members of the Republican Party, Susan Collins is among those who said that.
Let me ask you a question. Interesting question. Professors don't like these questions. If, as a 17-year-old, he forced himself upon a 15-year-old at a party, is that a disqualifier? If indeed he did this at the age of 17, should that exclude him from ever serving on the U.S. Supreme Court?
That's a tough question for me to answer.
To me, it's not. I mean, to me, no, that shouldn't be a disqualifier. The collection of his body of work, his life, his all the good, all the bad. Believe it or not, people ain't perfect. And I just think, Scott, we got to be real careful if we start looking at people who potentially serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. If they make a bad choice at the age of 17, are they penalized for the rest of their life for making that bad? And I'm hypothetical here. I mean, we have no idea who's being honest and who's not. But if she is telling the truth, and if he did that at the age of 17, for the life of me, I don't know how we find anybody to ever serve in public office again.
Well, and we can look at Bill Clinton as an example of a person who certainly was not the most moral individual in the world and yet remained president of the United States. Now, granted, there's a difference between being an immoral person. I would not certainly call Trump a moral person, and being and breaking the law. And I do believe that Clinton perjured himself. He should have been not just impeached by the House, but kicked out of the presidency. But we do have cases in our history where people have been disqualified politically because of mistakes they made. Alexander Hamilton's an example of that, who had an affair with a married woman and was disqualified politically, had no chance of winning the election of 1796. Mm-hmm. So we do have, I mean, if he did indeed force himself on her.
At the age of 17.
At the age of 17. But there are cases where a 17-year-old can be tried as an adult. Does that disqualify him? It's hard for me to say no, that it doesn't. And I realize that there are politics involved here, but
certainly it is a political issue because it's a political appointment. I mean, it's going to always be. All I'm arguing is, and I'm not condoning nor condemning, what may or may not have happened. All I'm arguing is, if we're going to sit around and wait on perfect people to serve an elected office, good luck with that. Good luck with that. And what I'll find offensive is the senators who have a slush fund set up to cover up some of these potential occurrences or not that they have with sexual harassment or sexual advancement.
Right.
They're going to sit there and scrutinize a guy who may or may not have done something at the age of 17. That's the way Washington works, and I think that's what people on both sides of the aisle are real frustrated and fed up with.
Well, and it's one of the reasons, I mean, we have to consider the times we're living in as well. When Anita Hill when Anita Hill was testified before Congress during Clarence Thomas's confirmation hearings, there was no Me Too movement. And in fact, even individuals like Joe Biden were unwilling to bring witnesses forward who would have supported what Anita Hill was saying, and he now regrets that. We live in much different times now, and the Me Too movement is very strong. It's very influential. Plus, there is the fact that the Republicans in particular are very concerned about the women's vote. Trump has been losing support among women. And they're going to be a key component in any effort by the Republicans to hold on to Congress in 2018 and Trump to win re-election in 2020.
Very well explained.
So all of this is playing a role here.
It's a very political issue, and it'll be interesting to follow. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you.